You are listening to the So Now What podcast with Lana Manikowski, episode number 118.
So now what? These three words raced through my mind time and time again during my journey through fertility treatments. I tried desperately to have a child, but never was able. I yearned for a community to join that could understand my struggles. I couldn't find one, so I created one with the So Now What podcast. I love that you found us.
I'm so glad to be with you again this week. If you are on YouTube, yes, I am still not in my normal place. I'm still on the road. I started my vacation back on February 16th. I have a total of 17 days that I am away, full of so much to talk about this week as we wrap up our final episode this month focused on relationships. The first episode I did this month was talking about relationships with your spouse or partner. Last week's episode was talking about relationships with your friends with kids. And this week's episode, I'm talking about relationships with colleagues and coworkers when you are the one who doesn't have children. But before I do that, let me just tell you what fun I've been up to and how I have been navigating building on my relationships in all these different ways through this travel and adventure that I've been taking part in California. On the 16th, Jack and I flew to Sacramento and we spent 3 days in an area called Grass Valley. Total cute mountain town. We stayed in this old mining hotel and did some deep dive focus and work on our relationship. And when I say work, it was more to get to this place in our relationship that we're feeling connected and in sync with one another. Because, like I talked about earlier this month, sometimes your relationships, you got to put some effort into them. If you want to keep them moving in the direction that you want your relationship to go in, it sometimes means taking time out from your crazy schedule. And maybe if you're anything like Jack and I sometimes are, because we don't have a firm start and stop time for kids, for pickups, for dinner time, we sometimes bleed our time over and we work really long hours and we don't really take time to set aside time for us. So part of our time away was doing just that. There's so much that we took away from this time that we had together. I know it's going to turn into some sort of course or something that I'm going to pass on to you because what I gathered from it was so great and is something that I really want to share with you. So be on the lookout for that. From our time in Grass Valley, we drove to Sonoma and we stayed in Sonoma for a total of 7 days. Jack has some of his fraternity brothers. He went to DePauw with a W University in Greencastle, Indiana. He was a Sigma Nu there, and he still keeps up with a group of them that they travel every once in a while together. They'll go skiing. And this time they decided to do a couples trip. So we rented an awesome house in Sonoma and spent 7 days. Just some days were wine tasting. We did some hiking, cooking, 2 days where we had a chef come in and cook for the whole group. It was so much fun. So we left Sonoma this morning. I actually put Jack on a flight and I stayed in San Francisco for the afternoon and met up with a girlfriend of mine when I lived in Washington, D.C. from 1997 to 2001. She was one of my first friends and her name is Melissa. She lives in San Francisco with her husband and 3 children. And I wanted to see her while I was close enough to be in her backyard. So I stayed an extra night in California. And then I head out to Phoenix, Arizona, where I'm meeting up with some other girlfriends, all who have kids. And I'm saying that on purpose because you heard me talk about all my friends with kids in last week's episode. So I'm spending a few days in Phoenix with some of my girlfriends. And then my sister and my niece are flying in over the weekend to Phoenix, and my niece is performing in a Serbian folklore festival. So she dances in a folklore group. Since I was all the way west, I thought I would plant my heels in and see what I can do and see who I could meet up with and how I could keep relationships growing and blossoming, not only with my husband at the start of the trip and throughout our time in Sonoma, but continuing on with friends that are near and dear to me that I want to make time for. And even though they have kids and they have their lives and things going on that they do, I have my life. And I love filling them in and spending time together and continuing to build on the relationships that we've had for all these years. So that is the update and how I am working through practicing what I am preaching to you this month in Relationships Month. And I thought it'd be nice to bring it home talking about our relationships at work and what it means to be maybe the only person in your workplace who comes to work on Monday and everyone's catching up on things and people ask you what you did. And I'm curious if you ever feel like you just don't really have as much interesting to say as the people with kids. And why is that? Why is it that we sometimes think that the things that we do with our free time or the way we spend our weekends seems underwhelming? Is it possibly that we are doing things or you're doing things for yourself or things that you're just maybe getting your footing on? Maybe you're just kind of exploring if you're not going to be a mom, what are some of the things you like to fill your time with? You may feel like you just haven't gotten your arms around what those things are. So you don't come to work convicted or excited to talk about them. How can that maybe keep you from sharing your excitement? Maybe it's okay to tell somebody, my husband and I tried something different this weekend. We went on a 3-hour drive to go to some random place. Jack and I have done that where we've read about maybe a museum or there's a festival of some sort. And we just decide that we want to spend some time together driving and coming back to work on Monday. And I tell people that, and they might be like, oh, you're so lucky. You're so lucky. I had to spend my weekend driving my kids to soccer and ballet and whatever it is. And why is it that, as somebody without children, we don't take ownership of the fact that we are able to do the things that we want to do because we don't have kids? And instead, we shrink away from that. What would it feel like to feel really excited about this time that you have and how you want to fill it and not have to feel like there's this comparison game when you go to work on Monday that you've got to have this thing that everybody just assumes is appropriate for you, but that in a way that you can have ownership, that you get to do what you want to do. So that Monday water cooler talk, maybe you don't necessarily have that type of issue, but maybe you find yourself being the only one in your workplace that doesn't have kids. And there's days that there's maybe a group project you're working on or something that has a deadline. And one of your colleagues has kids that have practice at 4 p.m. and they need to leave. And you feel like it's the right thing to do to take ownership of the project so that person can go. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that unless you feel like things get dumped on you in the workplace because you are the one who doesn't have children. So, what would it be like to set some boundaries for yourself? Maybe say, unless somebody pointedly asks me if I will pick up whatever they have to do, I'm not going to volunteer because you don't have children. It doesn't mean that you have to volunteer to cover for people if they have places to go. If you want to, awesome. I love that. I'm all over that for you. But if you find yourself being like a little begrudging of the fact that you are doing these things that you don't necessarily want to do or picking up slack for people in the workplace that is beyond what your expectations of yourself and your job, or maybe your manager has of your job, what would it be like to not volunteer? What would it be like if somebody asked you if you would do it and you had something else going on that evening? Maybe you had to pick your dog up from doggy daycare. Maybe you and your husband had a date night. Maybe you had a yoga class that has been on your calendar and you've been trying to prioritize doing things for yourself, but somebody at work asks if you can cover for them. What would your answer be? Most women that I've talked to, or women that I work with in my coaching practice, will say, "Oh, I don't want people to think that I'm not a team player." But what makes you more of a team player by doing things that you don't want to do? What if you had a conversation with someone and you just said, "You know, Sue, I would love, love, love to help you, but I can't tonight. But let's talk about a plan. How can you get out of here on time and I make it to the thing that I have going on and we both meet deadlines?" And like come with a plan together. Put some ownership on the people that are asking these things of you. And don't just assume that they assume that you don't have anything of importance to do because you don't have a child to go home to. Maybe it comes to having a conversation with your manager. I know that there are people that come to me and talk to me about the fact that they don't have kids and they're always the one expected to cover for folks on maternity leave or the men that get to take paternity leave. And because they're the ones that's just the good old standby trustee, their workload gets put on that person. What would it look like to really pay attention to whether that's something that you want to do? And what would it look like to have a conversation with your manager? And I'm just going to share some things that I've worked with some women through and say, I'd be happy to help, but I also would like to be compensated for my time. Why should you take on someone's work and not be compensated for it? If you don't want to be, no big deal. I am not here to evoke anything in you that you don't feel is a problem. But I've had clients of mine have that conversation. Or I'm willing to work X amount of hours. And can I make some of that time up in PTO? You're probably not going to be working 8 hours of your full work and 8 hours of the person who's out on leave. So, is there a common ground where you can track how many hours it is and then turn that into PTO, maybe a spot bonus, maybe, you know, some extra something that you mutually agree upon with your manager or with HR that draws out the job responsibilities that you're doing for somebody else. And what's that calculated into in your time, in your pay, in some sort of recognition that feels right for you? And maybe there's nothing. Maybe you are fine with doing that. No judgment here. But I just want people to understand that because you are childless in the workplace doesn't mean that your hand always has to be raised in order for you to feel like you are showing up as a trusted colleague. Because you didn't have children does not mean that you need to be dumped on in the workplace. It does not mean that your time is any less important than somebody who has a human child to go pick up. In my opinion, the things that you have on your schedule are just as important as your colleagues who have things on their schedule. So I wanted to wrap up relationships this month with really thinking about that and thinking about the workplace. A lot of us just immerse ourselves into work because we know we're good at what we do. We know that there's a lot of purpose and a lot of recognition that we can get through the work that we do. I get that. I am right there with you, sister. I get it. But when it starts to feel like a burden to show up at your workplace for any various reasons, or maybe there's some that I didn't point out. And if I did, please let me know. DM me if there is something else that has come up in your workplace that I didn't pay attention to in this week's episode. And I really want to work through it. So think about these things. Let me know how they land for you. I hope you have a beautiful week. And remember, it is never too late to discover your meaning. I'll talk to you next week.